Hello, welcome to the conversation. My name is Kris Kaim. With me today is Dean Klovens, advisory board member for geostrategic forecasting. Dean, how are you doing today?
Hi, Kris. How are you? I'm doing very well, thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Today, we're going to talk about intelligence collection, the significance of intelligence collection, and how it has changed over the years and where we see it going over the next several years. And Dean will be talking about that. But before we move on, Dean, could you please talk a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Um, I've got a variety of years in business, mostly in talent acquisition, strategic search. What I do is identify I call them high value passive candidates for a variety of roles in corporate America. I work very closely with some retained search firms and other organizations, as well as some human resource staffing groups in the Chicago area. And in addition to that, I've always had an interest in, particularly in foreign affairs and foreign policy, and specifically in the area of intelligence. Once upon a time, I had thoughts of getting involved in that, but due to some other circumstances, I went another route. But I've always kept an interest in that field. And the past several years, I've been involved more so from a writing and research standpoint. I've always asked, myself the question, the proverbial balance between civil rights and the use of intelligence means and methods. And I know the topic today is going to be discussing means and methods, and how sometimes it has an impact on one's, particularly in the United States. When it's overseas, it's a little different way of people looking at it. But the bottom line is you don't want to abuse, the United States does not want to abuse its intelligence efforts and having it negatively impact our rights as individuals, particularly U.S. citizens.
Let me ask you, what made you want to get involved in intelligence, or rather to learn more about it?
Yeah. Well, it. I'll be open about it a little bit, even though it's not why we're teaching intelligence today. It has nothing to do with James Bond, but when I was growing up, I always liked James Bond, to be quite honest.
Same here. When I was a kid, I was the same way. James Bond, I remember watching him growing up, and it was just fantastic. And I said to myself, I want to be this guy.
Well, and that may be it. The wannabe, the virtual spy, but it never came to fruition. But I always had an interest in being secretive, and what I mean by that, our government needs to do certain things without our knowledge, because if we knew about it, who knows how we would as citizens react. And just the interest, particularly in the areas of maybe surveillance, human intelligence, human as they call it, or even in use of satellites. That's always intrigued me, and no pun intended, but it's always intrigued me to get more involved from the standpoint of reading about it, writing about it. I've done several with a colleague of mine, a couple presentations on the topic of intelligence. Just recently, as an example, we provided a presentation to the International Studies Association in San Francisco, their 50th conference last year, and that topic was the use of intelligence and the balance of civil liberties in the United States and Great Britain, as well as in the state of Israel.
Now, for the sake of understanding the conversation, and for this episode, we're kind of going to have a 50,000-foot view of everything.
Okay. Yeah.
But for the sake of understanding the conversation, how would you define intelligence?
Well, there are many definitions. There are a lot of experts out there, and I don't pretend to be an expert. There are people who've devoted 30 years either in the service themselves or as academics. But I do understand what intelligence is, and it's basically gathering of information that's raw, that is then filtered, if you would, and then presented and goes through the intelligence cycle and then presented to the high decision makers of the United States, i.e. the Oval Office. Mr. Obama every morning gets his advisors in there, and they go over the night's intelligence on what's going on in the world and how it impacts our national security.
He meets
And
with the
so,
he meets with the NSC every morning for the morning report, as I understand it.
exactly. And I think the Jim Clapper of the National Intelligence, the new organization that came out of 9/11, does the reporting to the president as opposed to the CIA, which anyway, that's kind of what intelligence is. It's raw data being filtered to presented to key decision makers. It's not only the president, mind you, it's also people on the oversight committees of intelligence here in the Senate as well as the House, and obviously Joint Chiefs, military. But then again, the military has their own intelligence arm, and everything works in tandem, as we'll talk about.
And it's certainly it's certainly a 180 compared to the perception of James Bond and growing up watching
Sure.
007 films, because as you know, through personal experience and my understanding of the intelligence community, it's a very, very bland, very boring apparatus. Though it is necessary, it's not very glamorous.
You know what?
Um, Go ahead.
That's a good point. I might add too, in the topic of intelligence, there are plenty of books and research related to that particular world. There are individuals who have been involved in operations and analysis, and as I was alluding to earlier, they have a unique take on the world given their level of experience and involvement. Yet others, like myself, with strong interest in the field, can also, I believe, contribute as a person looking from the outside in. Most of the country look at intelligence as a bothersome tool that our government abuses, hypothetically or supposedly, or the conventional, and what I call that is the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom believes that government would abuse the use of intelligence and has that in impacting our lives daily.
Let's focus on the United States. I would like to eventually kind of segue, whether it's in this episode or a future episode, and talk
Sure.
about foreign intelligence operations. But
Sure.
excuse me, the United States. Now, in particular, specifically the United States, how has the how has intelligence played a role in the United States and the function of the United States and the influence of the United States in the past, particularly within the last 100 years?
Okay. Well, you
And
know what?
if you want to go back further, feel free.
Well, 100 years is a good point. First and foremost, the history of intelligence is a subject on its own. It can take a lot of time. There's a lot of things that have been going on since 1882, when the first naval intelligence was established. Prior to that, the United States obviously had intelligence gathering, but not centralized like we have today. Let me further explain. While intelligence gathering in the U.S. has been an effective tool, and it was effective during revolutionary times. I mean, George Washington was a spy master, as well as during the Civil War. The Civil War, while Lincoln was president, there were a lot of spies out there. The use of humans to pick up information was the key. But it wasn't until after, unfortunately, it was after Pearl Harbor when we were surprised, although that's up for debate whether we knew or didn't know about the Japanese potential attack on us. But it wasn't until 1947 when the National Security Act under Harry Truman created the CIA. Prior to the CIA, we had the Office of Strategic Service, created during the Second World War in I think 41 or 42. It was disbanded though in 1945 and reconstituted, like I said, in 1947 in the creation of the CIA. The main argument, though, I might add, Kris, in regards to why there was backlash back then in the 40s about a centralized branch, because the couple things come to mind. First off, gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail was one of the things that General Stimson said back. I think this was during World War I. It was also during Truman's time, prior to the creation of the CIA, the concern was they wanted to prevent the creation of an American Gestapo, particularly post World War II when you had the German Gestapo. So the history of the development of intelligence and intelligence apparatus here in the United States, it wasn't like automatic. People didn't say, "Oh, great guns, let's put everything together." There was a lot of concern that there would be abuse.
Was there any inspiration behind the creation of the American intelligence community, or was it something that was created simply from scratch?
Well, the CIA didn't occur overnight. Between 45 and 47, you had the development of the Central Intelligence Group under the direction of a Director of Central Intelligence. This was in 46. And then there was also the Intelligence Advisory Board that was developed. You kind of had the skeletal or the muscles of the CIA being, and intelligence in general, the centralization of intelligence being developed by these three groups. And again, it wasn't until 1947 under the National Security Act that the National Security Council was created, the CIA was created, but it wasn't, believe it or not, until 1949 when you started seeing CIA get budgets that were secretive. I mean, the Congress passed budgets to develop the CIA in areas of analysis, but also covert activity.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that NSC 68 that was developed in, I think, in 1950 was kind of set the tone of American intelligence in an effort to stem the Soviet Union and communist expansion across the world.
And that's absolutely true. And as compared to today, we don't have that luxury, if you would, of zeroing in on the issue, let's say, of the Cold War. And I could certainly get into later about what's going on today. But post-World War II, the issue of Cold War and the expansion of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, as well as Asia, by virtue of their proxy, China. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of concerns from the standpoint of our policymakers as to we need better intelligence. We need to make sure we know what's going on. And here's the thing, too. Being a democracy, sometimes, it's not a double-edged sword, but it can be at times because we're such an open society that back in the 40s, post-World War II, it was a filter of spies coming to the United States. Mm-hmm. And they came in, particularly prior to 45, when the bomb was built, we had the development of the atomic bomb with the help, actually this was post-World War II, with the help of Soviets. And so, and Germans, and the United States, who just finished the war with the German people, or the country of Germany, was helping German scientists come to the United States to help them develop the nuclear weapon. Obviously, in 1945, you know what happened to Hiroshima, so there was no, in Nagasaki, we know that the atomic bomb was already established, but our foe at the time, the Soviet Union, were concerned about that, but also the nitrogen. And so they sent their spies in left and right, and they weren't only Soviets. You had people from Great Britain. Mm-hmm. The Cambridge Five are a good example of what I'm talking about. And I don't want to get off the beaten path, but I just want to give you a flavor and a feeling of what was developing during the Cold War and why it was imperative that the United States further have a centralized intelligence. And, you know, mind you, again, being a devil's advocate, the people out there were concerned with the abuse of developing an intelligence arm of the United States because they thought it had an impact on our lives. But for people who know about the CIA, there's a provision in their mission statement in the National Security 68, as you said, that says that the CIA does not have any law enforcement powers. They can't arrest anybody. That's actually what this FBI does now and always has been doing. And so I think there's a little bit of concern that the people think that the CIA is blatantly abusing blatantly abusing the constitutional rights of individuals by spying on them, which is farthest from my mind. But I know past history, sometimes presidents abuse the use of CIA. Mr. Nixon did that, and the things do happen, and but comparatively so to the rest of what's going on, it rarely happens.
I want to talk a little bit about the Cold War, and I feel that, personally, I feel that the Cold War really shaped the methodology of how the intelligence community, in the United States at least, operated in an effort to fight against the Soviet Union. George Kennan, when he
Mhm.
wrote the long telegram,
On
basically outlined the
containment.
Soviet Union, and the threat that the Soviet Union posed to the Western world. Now,
Right.
at the time, it had only made sense to fight the Soviet Union force, but we had just got out of World War II. We had just got a very costly war in both resources, money, and certainly manpower, and it seemed like the general public would not have wanted to fight another war, especially with the Soviet Union. So it seemed that either we're going to go about this in two ways. One, through the use of proxy wars, and this is a conversation that Dr. Vasilios Demiris and myself have regularly about the act of proxy wars and how two superpowers use a smaller nation in an effort to fight each other through the use of proxies, hence the term. But also through intelligence gathering, whether it's through simple intelligence gathering, on plans or strategies or what have you, or just basic information, or through sabotage, assassination, and whatnot. But the Cold War, I always found fascinating because I like to say that it revolutionized warfare itself. And so, even if it was through a spy network, through espionage, and whatnot, I think that it really changed how we fought against other countries. And I'm curious to know exactly how intelligence collecting in the United States uh, changed over the course of the Cold War.
Oh, well, yeah, history dictates that it has changed. Let me just say this: that intelligence is not a product of war. It is normal. It is normal in that it's a tool used by every sovereign state. So, and whether the United States, its foes or its friends, all friends and all foes use intelligence on one another. So these recent allegations of the United States spying on Germany, for instance, and Brazil and what have you, more likely than not, there was a reason to do that.
Hmm.
Whether it's right or wrong, it's done by friends and allies. And so sometimes there's an exception to the rule, like with the United States, Australia, Great Britain, Canada, and New Zealand. They don't
Hmm.
really spy on each other. Nevertheless, Israel spies on us. Greece spies on us. We spy on them.
And
It's you know
and I like to argue that it's the product of a time. It's a product of tradition. It is something that has always existed at least within the last 50 to 60 years. And I believe that personally, it's a product of the Cold War, uh,
mhm.
something that nations all over the world did not did not exclude from, especially when it comes to
Well,
intelligence gathering.
absolutely, and keep one thing in mind. During the, I don't know how long ago, centuries this was, but when Moses took his people to the Promised Land, he used spies to
It
make
did.
to look at the terrain and to get an idea who was out there to make sure that it was safe and what have you. So they call it the second oldest profession, and so it's been around for a number of years, and currently we take notice of because of our press, our free press, and because from time to time things do get screwed up, and maybe more or less they should be taken to task by the American people or the world, or particularly when the press finds stuff out about the abuse that occurs. But I'll tell you this: the people that run our spy um, agencies, um, you'd have to be. it'd be crazy to abuse it and not get caught. I mean, there's a lot of things going on that you know, if someone abuses it, they'll once they will be found out based on whistleblowers, based on media. And the last thing the head of the CIA wants to do was to abuse the Constitution, which has an impact on morale of his organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry to get off the beaten path, but there's a lot of things going on. It's too dynamic to discuss in 45 minutes.
Well, it's perfectly understandable, and so, but you bring up a valid point, because you had mentioned earlier that even with the creation of the CIA, or even before that, there was always a critique of intelligence operations, because as you mentioned before, no gentleman reads another gentleman's mail, and so there seems to always be this protest against intelligence organizations, because they're a couple of reasons. One, they're secret organizations. I mean, like any secret society in the world, there's always going to be scrutiny, but especially when it comes to a very powerful state-sanctioned organization like the CIA,
Yeah.
that doesn't disclose its operations publicly, or rather personally, they shouldn't, um, because of the function that they do.
Right.
Um,
You know, keep in mind.
there's always going to be protests to that, because for a variety of reasons, but especially in the United States, we are an open society. We are a constitutional republic, and people are concerned that that by having, say, for example, the CIA and NSA conducting operations in foreign countries, which is part and parcel for what has always happened, especially within the last 100 years, they're concerned that their civil liberties, their civil rights would be violated, and it would be unconstitutional, because it violates the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, but that's right, and that only occurs. Now, there's debate when it comes to targeting Americans who happen to be in the Middle East, who are espousing the death to all Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Just recently, the sheik, I don't know if I named him right, but the sheik out of New Mexico. He's born there, and we targeted him under the Obama administration based on the fact that he posed a danger to the United States.
That's Anwar
Allah,
al Laki.
yeah, exactly. And so people like groups out of the ACLU and other organizations are concerned that we're targeting Americans, and so that's where you get into iffy situations. And
Mm-hmm.
but I guess what I was alluding to, what I'm getting at, is that the whole idea of a secret organization is to steal secrets from, again, friend or foe.
And some can argue that it is a necessary operation, because it allows the ability to prevent full-scale war.
Exactly. It prevents something. The threat to national security is high. It's always high in the United States, at least from my estimation. It also has an impact on our democracy, the citizens, and civil liberties, which are put to a test each and every time when something like this occurs. Um, when 9/11 occurred, at least the first 24 hours, and after that things kind of settled down. But the first 24 hours, everyone was like clamoring for, yeah, I don't care about my civil liberties. Let's just go out and find these people.
I remember that.
And so the opposite is true. When something like that happens, we tend to get to come together like everyone did, literally on the congressional steps on 9/11. All the people got together, were holding hands, and were singing, "Long live the United States of America," even post the towers going down. The point of all this is, for a fleeting moment, we understand the need to use force. We understand the need to use intelligence, and so on and so forth. But after a certain point of time, we tend to get back to normal, and which we should do. What's going on now should not impact our daily lives.
But what's interesting about that, though, is that unlike the Cold War, where everything was pretty much kept behind closed doors,
Yeah.
and I think part of the reason was that the American public, or the world public for that matter, didn't have the means to actually find out what was going on. There was no internet back then for public use, and so to find out what's going on this in terms of what the CIA is doing, what the NSA is doing, what the KGB was doing, or any other organization for that matter, was very limited. But in today's world, especially in the post 9/11 world,
Uh-huh.
technology has developed to the point to where you can find out what's going on in just a few clicks. In just a
Right.
few seconds, you can find out more about what's going on in a country across the world than you have been able to 50 years ago, where you had to consult encyclopedias, read foreign papers, listen to the radio, or watch the news on TV if you had one back then. And
Chris,
so,
but I might add that that even happens today, and that's called open intelligence, OSINT, as they call it.
yes,
Our analysts in not only the CIA, but it's other organizations within the intelligence community, as well as even outside of the private sector, they focus on stuff that's made public
hmm
because you get a lot of good information from that,
of
we'll
course. And while it's not necessarily a bad thing, because as an academic, one would use OSINT in an effort to further develop the research for a paper that one is writing,
yeah.
or what have you. But the issue that I see is that it has become increasingly harder for, say, the CIA or the NSA to conduct their operations without being scrutinized by the public. And with today's world, we have WikiLeaks, we have Anonymous, that's really dedicated to exposing such secrets for whatever reason,
Right.
however benevolent or nefarious, depending on what side you're on. And so it's become difficult for such organizations to operate because technology and the will has has allowed the common man to watch them more closely compared to
Mm-hmm.
what was even 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how is it that an organization like the CIA to operate in the 21st century um, without that scrutinization, or at least keep it to at a minimum level?
Well, again, I think what's leading the effort on what you just said is the first 10 amendments of our Constitution. That's kind of the linchpin of all this. If that is broken, then chaos and anarchy would occur. And so, to your point, the use of intelligence is has significantly changed since 1989, particularly when the Soviets fell, because uh, prior to that, if you were a CIA guy, you knew who your enemy was. Now 1989 impacts us, and we don't know who our enemy is. And I'm being a bit facetious. I mean, the the Soviet Union was the key and instrumental in the Cold War.
Exactly.
Not,
And
1980,
because it was such a large target, a large enemy, we were able to easily define it. But
yeah,
after the Cold War, we kind of enter a lull in the 1990s where the biggest threat was, I guess you can say, China, but even then at that time, who was to say? But certainly now, today, 2014, you have China, the Middle East, and various countries in the Middle East. You have Russia today with Ukraine. You have several different enemies that the United States they're certainly competing against in order to kind of stem in an effort to preserve the balance of power and the influence that the United States has remaining in the world. So it's unlike what it was back then, where you really had one enemy. Now we have several.
yeah.
And of course,
We
people will go back and forth and saying, "Well, that's because of American policies and this, that, and the other thing," and they might be right, but it's still the reality. The reality today is much different than what it was back then.
Well, yeah, and you asked the question, where do you see intelligence collection going over the next several years? I mean, secret intelligence is not only human intelligence, and again, human intelligence is another 45-minute discussion on its own. But it's not only humans that get us the information; it's also the spy satellites, it's defectors, it's all sorts, and the use of technology. Eavesdropping. I mean, again, this past summer or past couple years, the NSA was in the news a lot, um, and maybe rightfully so. Let's look at who's out there. even though we don't, I mean, we're kind of fluctuating as to which states are our enemies because let's face it, you have the issue of Syria that's going on there and what's going on in Iraq right now. You have North Korea, which is, if I had my druthers, I'd rather deal with what's going on in the Middle East than with North Korea.
Hmm.
That's really crazy. And then
That's
with,
that's that's a whole other conversation right there,
yeah,
North Korea.
and and then there's Iran, and I am ambivalent about where Iran stands as, I don't know if they're a friend, but I don't know how much a foe they are. And I
Hmm.
think that influence is from the state of Israel onto the United States, that they're concerned with what Iran does, particularly with bombs and so forth. But as we speak, uh, the United States is cooperating, working closely with the Iranian government in Baghdad. Now, how ironic is that we call them an enemy and yet we need their help to fight off? I guess it'd be the Sunni, uh, people.
Well, going back, I remember reading about how prior to 9/11 attacks in the 1990s, the CIA, or rather the overall intelligence community, still had the Russia ingrained in their minds. That they were operating in an effort to impede Russia and their influence in Europe, their influence overseas and other parts of the world. And so even after the Cold War, even through the late 1990s, that was, and I can't really fault them for that because it's been like this for decades prior, but it was still ingrained in their heads that Russia was the enemy. Now you had some people there, particularly in the CIA, that said, "Well, wait a minute now. We have this Osama bin Laden figure that's operating in the Middle East. He just bombed two embassies in Africa.
Eh,
He's causing chaos. In Yemen, he's causing chaos in other parts of the Middle East. Not to mention, there's other Mujahideen groups out there that are operating. How about we focus on them?" No, 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 you're crazy. They said they're not a threat. They're nothing you know, they're not worth dealing with. That's just a small ragtag group of terrorists operating in their region. They don't have any reach here. Well, a couple of years later, 9/11 happened, and so after that, the CIA and other agencies had to play catch up in an effort to find out exactly who these people were, and then they had to change the mindset again, and that process takes several years too. So now our thought processes, and by our I mean the overall intelligence apparatus of the country, um, our thought processes are ingrained in the Middle East with all the various players in the Middle East, all the various groups, the national leaders, the governments, etc., etc.
mhm.
But we still have to deal with Russia. We still have to deal with China. And it seems to me that the CIA doesn't really have the capability of operating on several fronts. It seems that we're only committed to operating at one front at a time. And I think that's to the detriment of our operations.
Well, no, it's also, if I hear you correctly, it's also one of the downfalls of being a superpower and the only supposed superpower in the world. So we're stretched thin. Our troops are stretched thin, as you could maybe attest to. But the use of intelligence too. It used to be very easy to maybe infiltrate or put someone in that was a close spy and can give you information on the Soviets, even though that was very, very dangerous. Like you said, we knew who the enemy was. Today, try to do that. I mean, my feeling is if the United States wants to infiltrate groups within the Middle East, they're going to need to figure out who in the eighth grade in the United States is of Arabic descent and has the language capacity, and just like the NCAA with respect to the sports, these athletes basically start out when they're even before high school, and some of the schools keep watching them as great athletes for their programs.
Now, to your
I think
knowledge, has something like that happened before, or is this something that you're proposing to happen now?
well, if it's happening, we should know about it because you're talking about a person's family. You're talking about, but I'm saying is that if I were the CIA, and if I knew how to do a program like that, I would hypothetically. This is kind of again a little bit off base here, but the city of Detroit has a vast Muslim population, Arab population. So let's say you're born in the United States, but and you grew up in a Muslim house. Your parents come from the old country, if you would, and you know the language. I would do. I would figure out a way of working with these individuals. It's like a coach going to an athlete's home and espousing the benefits of coming to my school because we could help you become a pro. Well, here's the other way around. You go in as someone with the government. You're helping our government withstand potential problems down the road. We'd like to educate you. We'd like to provide you with the funds to go to school, but take these classes. And it's just like the Army. When you go to ROTC, the Army pays or the military pays for your college, and then after that you join them for 4 or 5 years, whatever the amount is.
Well, I know after 9/11, the CIA was doing heavy recruitments for their agency. In fact, I remember looking at a New York Times article, and the CIA put an advertisement in there. I forget what it said exactly, but it was like join the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm thinking,
it was for their.
Is this a country club? Are we dealing with like American Airlines or something like that? I don't know. I mean, it's just the CIA is advertising for recruits.
But there's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, I think the benefit of that is that it wasn't that secretive. It wanted to prevent people thinking that they were that secretive. But going back to the point of using the idea of coaches going to recruit athletes. Mm-hmm. Why can't the CIA go out and recruit an 8th grader or his family and say, we would like to have your son or your daughter come to us when they finish college. We will pay for their college education and have them be part of our organization.
See, I mean, I can already see the media headlines on that. CIA tries to recruit children. You have the Huffington Post, the New York Times. All those organizations. I can see them having a field day with that. Now, it's not something I oppose. I think that's a very smart idea, and for all I know, for all we know, they probably tried that already. Maybe they're doing it right now. But most certainly, they have tried covert recruiting in the past.
Typically college students.
Exactly. If I recall the KGB and certainly the Chinese, I do know for a fact, recruit children at a young age to staff their cybersecurity divisions in the Chinese army. This is how they're able to hack into various American networks here in this country, because one, and the Chinese deny this, but they have a division within the Chinese military, an apparatus within the Chinese military that is devoted strictly for cybersecurity. And a lot of people that they have staffed there are young people in their teens, people in their 20s, and they find them at a relatively young age, especially people who are good at computers, and they recruit them.
Well, I think the next person you see with a ring walking down the street in their nose and yellow hair or pink hair, if they're involved in computers and they know how to do work in computers, those are the people that the United States should try to recruit.
I agree with you, but there's an issue with that, and I know the NSA for the last couple of years. A couple of years ago, I remember this. The CIA attended I forget what it was called. It's like a hacking conference or something like that. It was basically for white hat hackers, which is the good guy hackers, the people who hack company websites and networks in order to find vulnerabilities and then tell them, hey, this is what I found. And apparently you get paid good money for that. But the NSA tried that. They actually had representatives from the NSA by name go into there, and they actually talked to an audience full of young people. That's how you describe some of them anyways. And they all laughed at them. They all laughed at the NSA. And they're like, the NSA basically said, what's it going to take for us to to have you guys join us. And they're like, stop arresting us, stop doing this, stop doing that. So there's a very
Don't do background checks if there's a little issue with drugs and stuff like that. Don't worry about that.
we will have to adopt the don't ask, don't tell policy that Clinton
Yeah,
did. but
yeah,
but that's essentially what had happened. And so
I understand.
um, it becomes difficult because already these young people are predisposed to certain ideologies that might run counter to what the NSA and the CIA is trying to do, and
Right,
that's
right.
understandable. This is the product of a free society where you're
Yeah.
certainly able to feel that way. But if that's the case, then it becomes much difficult to recruit young people, unlike the Chinese, where it's very rigid, it's very one, almost
Yeah, but
homogenous.
that's a difference between a Democrat, a constitutionally based country like the United States, and a with a democracy with capitalism on top of it, the freedom everyone has to do just what you've described, as opposed to being in China. While it believes in, I think it believes in capitalism, it's still a very oppressive country. And so I think that you have two different things. If someone from the government of China recruits you, if you say no to them, who knows what that means for you in the future. Whereas
Right.
here in the United States, it's a different story. But going back to what you asked me about since the end of the Cold War, how has the intelligence community adapted to the changing shifts in not only the collection part, but also identifying, you had indicated priority targets for collection. All I could say is this. Let's take a look at post-Reagan and the real importance of, in 1989, again, using the 1989 when the Soviets fell. And then you back into the issue of Al-Qaeda inspired insurgent groups. That's now where we're heading, and we're still fighting them. We'll probably continue to fight them for a number of years. I can't put a number on it.
It's a business by itself.
It's a topic all by itself, yeah. And as you can see, Iraq is rapidly gaining strength as it accumulates new weapons, fighters, and cash. I mean, the ISIS group, as an example, right now is becoming stronger and stronger by virtue of bank robbing. They take money out of the banks in Iraq and use that to fuel their talking about weapons and people who are involved in the weapons industry. Someone's getting very, very rich by what's going on today.
Well,
But
that's another topic for another time. I'm gonna have to wind this down.
okay,
So
sure.
I mean, this is a very fascinating conversation, and I know me and you, we can talk about this
Yeah, we
for
can.
hours and hours and hours. I mean, our profession is essentially rooted in intelligence, and it's just an awe-inspiring thing personally. But I do eventually, at a later date, I do want to talk about the current scandal that the NSA is kind of embroiled in right now.
Sure.
Um, that's another topic. But
Yeah.
before we end, was there any final thoughts that you wanted to mention?
Well, you had indicated how you and I enjoy reading and hearing about the world of intelligence. But, as private sector guys, if you would, and not coming from that, well, at least I don't. I know your experience in the military may have touched upon that. The issue, the private sector, it's not only organizations like government that uses intelligence methods. Companies use them, and I'm not saying they go on spy on one another, although they do, but they don't want to admit it, and it's that's something that you don't see in the news that often, but nevertheless, it does happen. As business people, that's something I think is very beneficial to companies that would like to penetrate new territory, or maybe want a better understanding of the culture or the geography or the business climate in a certain company, or country like Sri Lanka or whatever, the Philippines. It could be or even it could be a province of France for all we know. So I see that as beneficial, particularly to the business community. And
I
so
agree.
let's
I think we're gonna reach a point where for lack of a better term, outsourcing our intelligence operations to private companies if we haven't
What's
already
going on
done
right now? I mean, let's face it, how many organizations are out there, former military people who are part of organizations that are private intelligence companies?
that. And that's what our company does as well. So I don't want to throw a pitch in, but it's true.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's I agree with you 100%, and I personally think that's the route that the intelligence community is going to go towards over the next several years, and it's certainly happening right now.
Yeah,
But I'm going to have to leave it at that. Dean,
sure.
you're a fantastic guest. I would really like to have you back on. Oh, and I will, because we have a lot to discuss.
Thank you. I appreciate that and look forward to it.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the conversation. I thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you very much, and take care.